family. We are back with a special edition of Building Rapport. Joining us to talk about fall camp and everything Auburn football before the season starts is our guy, Josh Pate from Late Kick. Josh, thanks for joining us.
I am happy to be here because if I'm here, then that means people actually have pads on and we're getting ready to play football. So I'm ready to talk about it.
Well, we're less than a month out from the season, Josh, and like you said, people are ready for football. I saw you at Media Days. We had a chance to talk a little bit about, what was going on there with every coach and some of the comments that we heard. Brian Harsin kicked off Media Days with a defiant tone. He said, listen, I know a lot of you guys didn't expect me to be here, but I'm here. Deal with it. And I wanted to ask you, I want to get kicked off by asking you, from an outside perspective, from your perspective, is Brian Harsin on the hot seat this season, and does he belong there?
Well, from my perspective, no. I mean, it's from my if I were running things, I would just say that's foolish. We're not talking about it again. If you want to know whether he actually is, you got as good a read on that as anyone. I think it's easy to say one thing in August. You really find out if you're on the hot seat by what happens if you go 7-5 or worse at all. Right. If you go 7-5 or worse, you find out how you stand. And if he goes 7-5 or worse, especially if some of those losses are blowout losses that come towards the end of the season against the bigger teams, it wouldn't surprise me to see some of that stuff pop up again. In fact, if it's 7-5 or worse, it would surprise me to not hear some of that noise. So even if I think it's foolish, it is what it is. But you're talking about what he said when he came to Media Day. That's the kind of stuff that someone who doesn't suffer foolishness says, especially once you get through a lot of the mess that they got through. And once your legal side of your representation says, all right, you're good, say whatever you want to. That's kind of what you do. You carry yourself professionally. I thought he kept himself above the fray the entire time anyway. We've talked about that on this show before. And so, I have the ability to look at Brian Harsin and criticize certain elements of him as a coach, but also appreciate him as a man, and then just blatantly root for him because, as you guys have probably noticed, there's this group, and I notice it on the national scene, there's this group of folks. And normally when that group of folks is collectively rooting against anything, I'm normally on the opposite end. Right. So that group of folks is rooting against Brian Harsin. Therefore, by default, I just find myself in his corner.
Yeah, absolutely feel the same way about that. Just want to get a little bit of a bead on where you feel like Auburn is as a team right now in the hierarchy of the SEC. Because, to your point, 7-5 feels like failure to a lot of Auburn fans, but realistically, is the 7-5 season something that should be Auburn fans should say, hey, I take that right now. Like, where do you think we should be at right there?
Always hard to answer this stuff. It's not that I can't commit to an answer. It's that I know Auburn. I grew up right next to it. And so I know it's easy for someone outside the family there to say, you ought to be happy with 7 wins. Vegas says your over-under is below that. So if you hit 7 wins, you hit it's easy to say that. But, man, if you're 55 or 60 years old and you went there or you played there and you've grown up there and you've invested your money and your heart and your soul and years of your life into Auburn football and athletics, it doesn't really matter that I tell you if you should be happy with 7 wins or not. You expect more. So I understand that side of the whole equation. I relate with it. I get it. I've got family that went there who feel the same way. But then on the other side, I ask myself, okay, we cannot change anything about the past. All we can do is present moving forward, try and progress the program, try and build the program. So this year, I would look at a 7-win season. Again, I would have to see how it pans out. But if I were to look at a 7-win season, and let's say Auburn's a 7-5 team, and 4 of those 5 losses are by a combined 19 points, where it's one of those things where you could sell me one bounce of the ball here, one critical injury less there, and we would have been a 9-win team. That is a no-brainer. Yeah, I'd be happy with it if I were an Auburn fan. Now, if I'm on the other side and we took care of San Jose State. Yeah, we took care of Western Kentucky. But when it came time, we were not competitive against Georgia. We were not competitive against Alabama. And maybe, you suffer a big hiccup at home against LSU. I think that's one of the most critical games of the year for Auburn. That's a different story, but it's going to all bleed back into recruiting, which I think we're going to talk about in a second. But it's the most important facet of this program right now, because I can tell you, I talk to folks on staffs all around the SEC. Every one of them thinks Brian Harsin's in over his head, not because of what kind of football coach he is on Saturday, but because the perception out there is that guy at Auburn believes he's just going to out-evaluate and out-develop everyone, and you're not going to do it in this league. So if they're right about that, then that could be a terminal flaw in the program. If they're wrong about that, we'll start to find out this year.
But Josh, what you just described about the one bounce of the ball, that was last season, wasn't it? I mean, that's what happened last season. Nobody blew Auburn out last year, not even Alabama. I mean, Georgia arguably was the only team that looked dominant, and that game was close for 2.5 quarters. So the season that you're talking about, I want to ask you, what kind of marginal improvement, because going from 7-6 to or 6-7 to 7-5 is marginal improvement over what they did last season. So what kind of things need to look different in a season where you're literally just winning maybe one more game for it to be acceptable and get him to year 3?
So I was looking over here because I want to reach and grab something. So these things right here, these preview magazines, this gives a very warped idea to people of what talent is and how talented teams are. Because if you don't have guys littering those preseason all-conference lists and all-American lists, or you don't have a bunch of folks who had 4 and 5 stars next to their name, you are viewed as just being in an entirely different galaxy than the elite teams that you play. But the reality, we do this exercise every year at 24/7 called the blue chip ratio. Bud Elliott takes time and aggregates it every year. And it just shows, it's meant to be a broad strokes thing that shows how talented rosters are. Auburn's in the top 15 in the country. But that's not the way they're perceived. And they're perceived that way because of the shadow that they have to exist in down here with all those other top 5, top 6 type brands there. But and I know, and those results show on any Saturday, there's not this wide gulf of discrepancy. It's inches here, it's inches there. That's what a football game is. That's what it always will be. That's the beauty of the game. But then you start to look at record last year versus record this year. And it's such a, I don't want to call it a lazy way to argue it, but that's all we'll hear. We'll hear, well, you went 6-7 this year. You went 7-5 this year. So you either improved or you didn't improve. There's so many thousands of other factors in play here. So when I'm watching Auburn this year, since you asked, I'll want to know, are some of these names that you hear whispers about in fall camp at receiver, do they have a guy to get them the ball? Is that offensive line, do I look at the average time between snap and pressure on quarterback? And do I see a quarter of a second extra this year on average? Do I see more protection from my guy there? Do I see, here's the other thing to watch. We talked about this last year, and it's the same theme this year. Whoever starts, if it's Zach Calzada, whoever it is, do I see a different Zach Calzada or fill in the blank Auburn quarterback when they're playing LSU in week 5 than I do at home in weeks 1 and 2? I view those couple of first 2 weeks as an extension of training camp, which is a dangerous way to look at it if you're a coach, but I'm not a coach. So I look at it and I say, I don't think Auburn's kind of like Michigan. Michigan starts this way. They don't have to have everything figured out by the time that they tee it up in the first week of September, but shortly thereafter, they do have to have it figured out. But it's just it's execution on third down. It's situational awareness, which would have won them the Iron Bowl last year if they had more in the fourth quarter. And we wouldn't probably be even having the Brian Harsin conversation. It's that kind of stuff. It's not mountains. It's just little molehills here and there.
So, I mean, you said something interesting, though, about talent evaluation and development not being able, or the perception is that Brian Harsin feels as if he can use that to conquer the hurdle that is the talent gap, right? And I want to talk about that a little bit because I don't know that tracks with the results, right? Like if you look at the average guy that they're bringing in right now in this class, now they haven't signed a ton, but they're 4 and 5 star guys for the most part coming in the next class. So I do want to ask about, do you think that this staff, the perception is accurate about what this staff focuses on? Or do you agree with that perception, or is that just what you're hearing?
I never knew Harsin personally before he came into the conference. I still don't call myself knowing him personally. I've had a couple of conversations with him, but I I'm in a position where the opinions I've heard that start to shape mine are other people's opinions, which I try and avoid.
Right.
As far as what I've watched him do, I think he has come in. I think there's a modicum of truth to it, is what I'm trying to say. Because I think when he first came into conference,
Yeah, I would agree.
Yeah, well, he's had success. So it would be, it would be anti-human nature not to feel like what I've done has worked. Let me go apply that at a higher level. But then, Billy Napier's learning this lesson right now. Brian Kelly, in a way, is learning this lesson. All three of us know this lesson. It's just a little bit different world down here, because the aggregate of the quality of player and the quality of opponent that you face every week roster-wise is on a different level. And you get yourself into a situation where there may be a Saturday where the lesser talented team out schemes the more talented team and out develops them and out executes them. And you say, man, how did they win that game? Like Michigan State used to do it with D'Antoni against Ohio State up in the Big Ten. But what you don't see those teams do is you don't see them do it 12 weeks in a row, because eventually you run up against a more talented crew, and their coaches can also develop and their coaches can also evaluate. They just, by nature of their recruiting prowess, gave themselves the ability to start on third base against you. And you can't do that for 12 weeks in a row. One game, anything can happen. 12 weeks, it can't. What I think's happening is I think they're realizing that they're never going to change the principles. They're never going to change how they evaluate and certain core fundamental tenets of the program. What I think they can do as a staff, and he probably has done, is he's gotten down here and he's hopped on the treadmill and realized it was already going 20 miles an hour. He didn't really get the chance to speed up. And you evaluate yourself. And he's faced all these teams in the SEC now. He stood across the ball from them, across the field from them, and he's been able to measure his athletes versus their athletes. And so he knows where he stands. And if he realizes that, I guarantee you he's understood and done some soul searching and said, there's some stuff about me I've got to improve. And one of those things is probably we got to get a little more serious, and we got to invest a little bit more energy on the front end of recruiting instead of investing it all on just the back end, because I know how to cook the meal, but man, it would be nice to have better ingredients to work with.
Josh, in the first conversation the War Rapport ever had with you, we asked you about what Brian Harson's message in recruiting needed to be to get guys to come into a program where you hire a guy from outside the SEC, maybe doesn't have roots in the South, and you haven't put anything on film yet for recruits to see, right? During media days, I got a chance to ask him a question in the main session, and my question was, again, what is the message to recruits right now about why choose Auburn? He responded and said, watch. Right, watch what we do, track what we do on the field this season, and you'll see why we need to be a part. Why you need to be a part of it. Now, you had said, last year that if you were Harsin, your message to recruits would be, we'll get something on tape, but we were going to tell recruits, hey, this is what we are trying to do, but we just need you to make it successful. How successful is that message going to be this year? And realistically, again, what do they need to get on tape? What is the watch that he's talking about that they need to get on tape for recruits to start to, see Auburn as more of like the obvious choice for them?
Yeah. Well, the Iron Bowl is a perfect example. If Bama comes in there and drags you 36-3, that's not something you can take to a kid and say, look how close we are. You may have been the difference in this game, but man, when you have not let the eventual SEC champ in the end zone until the latter portion of the fourth quarter, I mean, think about me going into the living room of a high 4-star outside linebacker. Think about me going into the living room of a high 4-star slot receiver and telling them, hey, look, we already play the kind of defense that I want you to be a part of. You don't have to guess whether we can do it. Or with the receiver, imagine what 17 more points on the board would have meant for us here, man. We would have put them away. They would have been done. Right. So my message, it's the same thing. My message to them is, I know that, the rest of the world may try and tell you we're a long way away, but the tape says otherwise. You're speaking football language to a kid now. Look at the tape. Look what it says. Look at what I'm dealing with right now. I know we're close. I feel like we're close. The tape says we're close. There's no blowout here on this resume. And we haven't even gotten to plug guys like you into our program. We inherited players that we inherited, but we want to build with our kind of players. You're our kind of player. And so then at that point, if they buy that message, all you have to do is sell Auburn to them. It's easy to sell Auburn. The place sells itself. So if you can sell your vision, basically you're the starting pitcher. Your vision is the starting pitcher. You let Auburn be the closer, and you're good to go.
A quick follow-up, Josh. Auburn is going to have one really noticeable change, and it's at quarterback. Bo Nix took his ball and went west to Oregon. In your opinion, how difficult is it going to be for Auburn to replace what he did at quarterback this season?
I think it's not a nothing, but I also don't want to say it's a Herculean task that's in front of them either.
That's the right answer, Josh.
We had mixed results, so it's a mixed answer. What I'm interested, I remember when Auburn played A&M out in College Station last year. I was out there and afterwards talked to some people around the A&M program, and I was talking about Calzada, and they let me know at the time. They said, "Don't be talking about this publicly," but he's way more injured than people know. He's had injuries that haven't been disclosed, and since then we found out about him.
Yeah, he told us about it.
Yeah, some of them had to be operated on, and I say that to say I don't think we know what he can do when he's fully healthy. Now, fingers crossed, because sometimes you say that about a guy and he never ends up being healthy, like the kid at Indiana who just transferred to Washington. We haven't seen him finish the season yet. Zach Calzada is a little more sturdily built than Michael Penix, and I got fingers crossed that we do get to see him, because if we do get to see 95+% of him, I think he's capable of a lot. They thought he was capable of a lot. I mean, Jimbo still talks highly of him, and I don't think it's coach speak. I don't think it's just word salad either. So, yeah, I mean, look, there were times where Bo Nix made you say, wow, that's one of the best quarterbacks in the country. There were other times that made you say, who else do we have? So I think they'll be okay. I think they'll be fine.
All right.
So I do want to talk a little bit, though, about perception of how the staff thus far has been evaluating other staff members, right? So we've seen an upheaval at Auburn in both of the coordinator positions are going to be new this year. Is there a perception that this staff can coach well in the SEC, not just recruit well, but like X's and O's wise? Do we feel like, outside of Auburn, because there's some people who have their doubts about whether or not Eric Keesaw can be a good play caller. Like, I don't know what the perception is outside of Auburn of those sort of things.
Most guys don't question that at all. In fact, I can't think of a coach I spoke with over the past few months that questioned the game day or procedural capacity of that staff. They only questioned recruiting. That's all they questioned. That's all staffs down in the SEC want to talk about anyway. But I talked to some folks now who in the past have been very open to criticizing the game day chalk aspects of some of their peers. They don't question those guys. Now, I think part of that's because they don't know a whole lot of them, because they've been in different time zones their entire career. But the other part is, I just think Brian Harson's reputation, and therefore the reputation by default of anyone he trusts to be his coordinators, has preceded him. I think they're too busy questioning whether they're going to be able to recruit. That's what people think will do him in if he's done in. It has nothing to do with what happens on Saturdays.
Like I got a chance to ask Saban during media days about how he stays ahead of kind of the coaching curve with so many good coaches in the SEC West. Now, does it matter, you think, that the successes he had were in the Mountain West Conference, and is football just football, and you figure it out where you're at?
Well, that's where the answers differ. I believe it's the latter. It helps to have, in fact, it's imperative to have a working knowledge of your region, but that is because of the talent acquisition aspect. That's because of the sort of colloquial aspect. It's not because the field is a different dimension in Baton Rouge than it is in East Lansing, Michigan. The same thing wins down here that wins out there, that wins up there, etc. Nick Saban's a perfect example of that, by the way. So I have gotten so tired this past few months about Brian Kelly. Man, people have said it about him. He's not a fit. He's not a fit. And I ask them what they mean, and they just give me nonsense answers. They talk about his accent, or they talk about foolishness that's not football related. With Harsin, same thing. Well, he got it done, but that was the Mountain West. And I ask them what the difference is, and they say, well, those teams out there aren't as good as the South. And I ask them, are they going to make him use those players, or is he going to get access to players that Auburn gets access to? Well, that doesn't matter. Well, it matters a whole lot, friend, because
right.
if you put someone in a position where they have more to work with resource-wise, then all of a sudden their level of output increases. I felt like if Chris Peterson would have ever left Boise and came down here instead of going to Washington, I thought he would have been ultra successful. But that's because I believe that if you have those fundamentals, if you have success principles in this game, they'll travel anywhere you go. They'll fit in your suitcase no matter where you're going. But it does come down to talent acquisition. It will come down to that. So you can afford to take the field as long as you're in the same vicinity, talent-wise, as your opponent, and you give yourself a really good chance. There can't be massive discrepancies. That's where you got to make things up. And that's where it's important to start either building familiarity quickly with the region you're in, or hiring a bunch of guys, both front-facing and behind the scenes, that have ridden these roads way before you ever got down here.
Josh, I want to close out asking you or getting you on the record. I get Josh Pate on the record about expectations. Now, you may have done this on your show already, so if you have, forgive me. But in your estimation, if you had to pick a record for Brian Harsin at Auburn football this year, Auburn football does what? What's the end record here at the end of 2022?
I ended up making their over one of my best bets of the year, and I only did 3 of them. So West Virginia, I think, was one of them. I did Ole Miss under 7.5, and then I did Auburn. The reason is, I think it's a little unfair that we actually, all of us on here, we've had a little bit closer access to that team than the general public does. So when I say part of what has rubbed off on me is the overall internal vibe of the team, you guys know what I mean when I say that. That has nothing to do with a play that's going to get called or an extra player you don't know about that's all of a sudden going to add 3 points per game. But there's something to be said when you can intangibly bottle something up, when you can get a locker room to bottle something up. And that's the stuff that happened with Harsin. And you can have them harness that. I think that's going to be part of Auburn in the early portion of the season this year. And then the second part of that, and here's what's most imperative for me in my over. So I'm going 7-5, I guess, or better is my prediction. What's imperative is they just need to protect home field. They don't leave there for 5 weeks. And so while everyone else is thinking about Auburn in totality, I'm thinking about what happens week to week. And they got 2 games they'll be favored in to start the year. And then we see Penn State come in there. And that's a close game last year on the road. That'll be a coin flip game, point spread wise, at home. Penn State hadn't played in that kind of humidity or that kind of environment combined with humidity in a long time. That's a 3:30 game, 2:30 Central, by the way. And then Missouri comes in there in week 4. That's already another conference game. Auburn's better than Missouri. Auburn should beat Missouri. And then that LSU game in week 5. Those are all games that if you ask the public, how's Auburn going to be week 6? They're not going to be undefeated. Well, okay. But you don't play 6 games at once. You play 1 game per week. And every single week I just laid out for you, there's a very strong path. There's a very strong case to be made for Auburn winning those games. And that really goes for if quarterback's a little bit better than we think it'll be, and that passing game's a little bit better. So I am heavily banking on them starting 4-1 or 5-0. And if they do, then I'm going to be okay even when things get tougher because they got a couple of wins left if they start 5-0. So I went 7-5 on the low end. I went over 6 wins, and I actually put my own semi-hard-earned money on it.
All right. Well, guys, another great edition of Building Rapport with our guy Josh Pate, who just confirmed that he is as smart as I thought he was, because I also dropped a bag on the over as well this season. So we will celebrate or commiserate together come December. But Josh, I want to thank you for joining us, as always, giving us your great expertise on Auburn football, and thanks for being here, man. We look forward to having you back.
I appreciate you guys. Love what you're doing. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already.
Yeah. Guys, that's it for another great edition of Building Rapport with our guy Josh Pate. If you want more content like this, please hit like and subscribe. We are the War Rapport on almost every single social media platform. TW Rapport on TikTok. We're signing off, and as always, War Eagle.